All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, DFSCA Requirement Drug and Alcohol Prevention Program Notice. My name is Jennifer Nails, one of the graduate assistants at IHEC. I'll be your moderator. I am assisting Madison, the Assistant Director of the Illinois Higher Education Center for Drug, Alcohol, and Violence Prevention, and we are very excited to be hosting today's event. For those of you who are new to GoToWebinar, you will see the control panel on the right of your screen. This is where you will find the question box, which is where you will be able to ask any questions. All attendees will be muted for today's program, but that does not mean you cannot participate. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Eric S. Davidson.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Happy Wednesday. It's middle of the week. Hopefully you've had a great week thus far. Hopefully you will continue to have a good week. And being that many of us are in spring, hopefully several of you have had commencement. For those of you that are having commencement this week, congratulations on surviving another semester. And for those of you that have commencement coming in a few more weeks, hang in there. The end is in sight, and have a remainder of a great semester. For those of you that are joining us, this is part 2 of a 4-part series session on the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act. Last time when we met was just really a general overview and introduction to the Act, its requirements, a little bit of its history, and a little information about how the Act has been enforced and penalties and those types of things. If you missed the first week, no problem. That session is recorded, so if you want to go back and get access to it, Madison and the folks at the center have that available and can make that available to you. I believe it is online on the IHEC website. If not, Madison can get you that recording, and you can go back and retrieve that information. For those of you who were with us last time, welcome back. Glad that you came back for a second outing. Hope all of you will continue to be with us for this outing as well as the next few outings. We're gonna go ahead and jump right into the content. As I said, last time we met, we talked about the history, the primary requirements, the elements of certification, and how the Act was monitored and enforced. Today, we are mainly going to focus on the Drug and Alcohol Prevention Program notice and what is required of that notice in terms of the elements and the content that goes into that notice. We're going to talk about who is required to receive that notice, how often that notice should go out, and how often people should receive it. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the best practices and ways that that notice has been distributed. Along the way, we'll talk about the past of that notice and how the past really has evolved and impacts what we can do today. As with last session, especially for those of us who are new today, if you are not familiar with complying with the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Regulation Guidebook, I highly recommend it. This is the guidebook that the Department of Ed uses to provide guidance regarding the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses regulations. It in many ways is considered the Bible. One of the things that I will point out is that this book was last published in 2006. So it is over 16 years old. And a lot of questions that I often get, particularly with the program notice, regards electronic distribution. And you'll see that being that this book is 16 years old, there was not a lot of guidance that the Department of Ed gave at that time regarding electronic distribution. Some things have changed. But if you go to this book and look at it in terms of the print, you'll find not a lot of guidance or updates regarding electronic distribution. So we'll talk about that in a little while when we get to those slides. Again, a great resource, and highly recommend that everybody look at this and use it in your work with your policy program notice, your biennial review, as well as considering what you do on your campus as a substance use program. When we think about the annual notification, I always like to say that this is not the same as the Clery notification. A lot of people will confuse the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act notice with the Clery notice, and they really are two different, distinct, and specific notices. There may be some overlap between the two. There may be some content that can be shared between the two, but they really are two different notices. Some schools will sit there and go, oh yeah, we're dealing with Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act because we've distributed the Clery notice. If you're not distributing both, you are not meeting both mandates. Clery is very specific, very precise, and has a reporting element to that notice. The Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act notice does not require you to report violations of policies and things like that. The policy violations are really left to the biennial review for the drug-free schools. But the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act Drug and Alcohol Prevention Program notice does have some specific details and requirements that you have to include. And one of the things that I tell schools is that if your drug and alcohol prevention program notice is less than 2 pages, you're probably not doing it correctly, and you're probably not meeting the standard. The other thing that I say is that your drug and alcohol prevention program notice is much more than your institution's substance use policy or statement. A lot of times I will consult with schools and they'll give me a statement that's a paragraph, a half page, and they'll say, here's our drug and alcohol prevention program notice. And I'll have to sit there and say, well, this doesn't meet the requirements. It doesn't contain content meeting the specified areas of the law or the regulations. And you really need to redo this because you're not in compliance with what the feds want. So again, not Clery, completely different and distinct. And it can be a pretty lengthy document when you put everything into it that's supposed to go into it. One of the conversations regarding the drug and alcohol prevention program notice that has come up within recent years, especially when individuals look at the program review findings of institutions that have been found in violation, is whether or not the Department of Ed views monitoring of the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act as a stepped approach. And some interpret the program review findings as being that the first step is having and disseminating a drug and alcohol prevention program notice. And the second step is having your comprehensive drug and alcohol prevention program. And again, prevention program being a primary prevention program intended to prevent the use, distribution, and sales of illicit drugs and alcohol. Prevention, not necessarily intervention or treatment. And then the third step being the biennial review, reviewing your programs and your policies. Some would sit there and say that you could have a program and you could be doing your biennial review, but if you don't have a prevention program notice, or you're not containing the information that needs to be in the program notice, by failing to be successful in that first step, it really doesn't matter what you've done in steps 2 and 3, you've kind of missed the whole entire ball. And again, that's an interpretation of some who have looked at the program review findings. I take a slightly different interpretation, And perhaps that's because my background is in psychology and health education and promotion. And I know that a comprehensive program using a social ecological approach and using some of the best practices and evidence-based practices that we have today involve more than just sending out a notice. You could be doing good work without the notice. So I personally look at things a little bit more differently based upon the science and research, but also know that that program notice is important. And some will sit there and say, you have to have that, and if you don't have it, nothing else that you do matters. So again, it's very important that you're doing the notice and that you're doing it right and that you're distributing it in a way that makes sense. Now, this notice requires annual notification. And what many people take annual notification as meaning is that we have to send it out once a year. And really, that's not what the Department of Ed intends with this notice. What they really intend with this notice is that each employee and each student who is required to get this notice gets it at least once within a 12-month period. So, for example, your institution may have an initial distribution in the fall, and you send it out to all your faculty and you send it out to all your students, and everybody gets it. You can't rest on your laurels and wait another 12 months to send it out again, because between the time you send out that policy, you have new students who probably come in the spring, you have new students who come in the summer, and you also have new employees who are hired at different points throughout the year after that initial distribution. And everybody needs to get the policy within that 12-month period. So while you have a notification in the fall, you still need to send a notification to your new spring students, a notification to your new summer students, and you still need to make a distribution to new employees who join your institution after your initial distribution. You'll see on this particular slide that's before you at the bottom a graphic, and that is a cutout from a program review finding from a school that got sanctioned and consequated, that really hit the school because they were only distributing the notice once a year. And basically in their program review finding, they were told, it's good that you're doing it once a year, but you're missing all these other people, and you've got to do it multiple times throughout the year to catch the people that were not at your institution during your initial distribution. Which leads the question, who is supposed to get the notice? Students and faculty. And when you look at that guidebook that I referenced at the beginning of this presentation, all students are referenced within Chapter 2 of the annual notification. And when we look at the standards of conduct subsection of that book, standards of conduct are to be applied to all students who are registered for any type of credit except for continuing education units. So when you think about who the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act applies to in terms of students and who this notice needs to be sent to, it's really any student who comes to your campus that is getting any type of credit except for continuing education students. That was probably a lot easier to discern and decide back in the late 80s and early 90s when this legislation and the regulations were created. We know that higher education has evolved, and probably since that time, many of your campuses, which were primarily, if not entirely, all residential, have probably diversified its student offerings. You probably have a greater number of commuter campuses. Your campus may have programs and cohorts that meet physically in person at other locations off campus. Many of our campuses now have students that are online, students that are hybrid, students that reside miles, if not states away, that are taking online courses. We also have a much higher number of students that are in high school taking dual credit classes. Those students can be online, those students can be in their high school, but chances are students in all of those categories are probably getting academic credit for their work, including the dual credit high school students. So based upon the regulations and law, all of those students should now be getting this notice, and they should be getting it at least once a year. Students who are also conducting research, engaged in student teaching, internships, externships, practica, students who may not be on your physical campus, but may be elsewhere, should also be getting this drug and alcohol prevention program notice because they are getting credit, which is not considered a continuing education unit. When we look at faculty, basically all of your employees should be getting this notice, regardless of whether they're working on campus, whether they're working remotely, whether they're working off campus, whether they're full-time or they're part-time. I've had some interesting questions lately about individuals who are contracted and employed through third parties. So for example, if you work on a campus and your dining services are contracted through a third party vendor, they should probably also be receiving a copy of the particular notice. If you have other contractors who are working on campus, they should probably be getting a copy of the notice as well. So in addition to your full and part-time employees, I would strongly recommend that contractors also be getting it. And one of the things that I've not been able to find is whether or not Clary has an example or exclusion criteria related to third parties. So if anybody knows that, please let me know, because I would be interested in that answer. A third group in which that the drug and alcohol prevention program notice is to be made available to would be incoming students and families, as well as the public. You don't necessarily have to distribute it to incoming students, family, or the public. You're encouraged to do so and make it publicly available. But what's important to know is that if anybody requests it, you need to be making the notice available to them. So whether it's a parent at orientation asking about it, a community member who hears about it, ask about it, if it's requested, you are to be making it available. And my understanding is that a FOIA request does not need to be made in order to receive this particular document. Again, we are to be distributing this annually in writing, but again, annually is kind of misleading. Everybody is to at least receive it once during a 12-month period. Terms of distribution. When we talk about this, there is active distribution and passive distribution. And the Department of Ed does not consider passive methods as meeting the requirements or expectations. So when we think about passive methods, that would be like having your policy printed out and put on a table at orientation and letting people walk by, and if they want to pick it up, they can. If they don't want to pick it up, they just leave it there. That is a passive method, and that would not meet the requirements. Just having it on a website without directing people to it, without sending an email to everybody saying, we're required to provide this to you by federal law. You can find this policy available online. If you don't send any email out, which is intentional and active, and you just put it up on a website, that is a passive method, and that does not meet the requirement or expectations of the Department of Ed. Making the materials available to those who wish to take them does not satisfy the requirements. One of the things to think about and consider is that you have to be able to describe what steps you're taking to ensure distribution of the notice to all students' employees in order to establish compliance. And this is one of the areas that I often see when I review biennial review reports that is often overlooked. So when you sit down and write your biennial review report, you will want a section on the Drug and Alcohol Prevention Program notice. You'll want to talk about how you are distributing it. What are your primary means of distribution? How are you doing it? When are you doing it? Who are you distributing it to? The channels that you're using. You'll want to have that summary within your biennial review. If you're using secondary channels, which are passive, I would consider including those as well. I kind of think that a shotgun approach, the more ways that you can get that drug and alcohol prevention program notice out there, the better off things will be. More is better in this case, in case someone has questions down the road. In terms of ways to distribute it, I would encourage everybody to remember that the law and the regulations are over 32 years old. And I would encourage people to think about, when it was in the late 80s and the early 90s, how were institutions expected to comply and distribute the policy? And what technologies were available at that time, what were prevalent, and then what are the technologies that we have today that we didn't have or that were not commonly used at that particular time. A lot has happened in 32 years. A lot has changed. And again, the laws and the regulations have not been updated. So anything that has changed has been informal, has not really been noted in the 2006 manual that we referenced earlier. There's a lot of loose interpretations about what we can and what we can't do. When we started this endeavor 32 years ago, the intent was that you would use your campus mail system to get the policy out, the notice out to on-campus students. And for those that were off campus, whether they be faculty or students, you would use US mail. And that if the US mail brought it back to you, you would actually then figure out what the new address was of the student and you would remail it. And you would continue sending it out until it no longer came back. And then that was the assurance that the student had received their policy notice. But you were expected to do due diligence to make sure that every student got their notice, especially those that were returned to you. But some schools distributed it through required courses, through orientation, including in registration packs, including it with the student handbook, dissemination through advising when it was mandatory. Any method that was kind of required that they could ensure that every single student got it. I would say that these might make good secondary channels of communication. In today's world, if you have the money and funding to be able to print out the policies and distribute those that way. Traditionally, staff and faculty would receive them through their paychecks, their W-2 form, perhaps in a faculty staff handbook. One of the things that I would say that I've seen countless times in my work with schools, as well as in some of the program review findings, I think it's common for institutions to give a copy of the policy to employees at the beginning of their employment when they start their relationship with an institution. That's good and great, but remember, every faculty and staff member needs to get a copy of this every single year. Just giving them a copy once at the beginning of their employment is not sufficient for this particular act and its regulations. And as with anything, a combination of methods of distribution really works best. In 2006, if you look at the guide, this is really the statement that they have. At that point in time, they had not developed an official policy on electronic dissemination. Basically, they said if you do it, you have to ensure distribution to all students' employees. And it was very vague and very ambiguous, and there was really no criteria given as to what they would audit if they came in. Things had evolved a little bit by 2010. In 2010, the Department of Ed held its last higher ed alcohol and other drug meeting. Prior to that, they had some good money, and they would have an annual higher ed alcohol and other drug meeting quite frequently. It was a pretty great conference. It was considered one of the better higher ed substance use conferences at that point in time. And at that last conference, they had a panel discussion, including staff from the Department of Ed, talking about drug-free schools and Campuses Act. And this was one of the topics that came up. I was in the audience. And really what was deemed acceptable at that time. And if you are delivering the policy by email is probably what's guiding your delivery practices. If you have email delivery and you can establish and indicate that email goes to each and every individual, and it's one of your primary means of communication, and you have policies indicating that email is your primary means of communication, that's a first step. You have to be able to ensure receipt. And they typically like to say that you have to have a clear majority of your student, staff, and faculty who are accessing your campus email. So if you're aware that your campus email is not being utilized by your student, staff, and faculty, that they're not opening it up, they're not going in, that they're not checking your email, and your percentages of email utilization and opening are low, email distribution is probably not the way to go. At the time, they basically said if you put the notice in an email, you have to have the entire notice in the body of the email. And that included tables and charts. You could not link or use URLs to content. Everything that you would put in a paper document would have to be in the body. That would create a very long email. And then the other thing would be like its predecessor with the US mail. If emails were bounced back or returned, you would have to figure out how to get the email to the student or to the faculty when those emails were returned or bounced back. So for the longest time, this was the guidance that we had for email distribution. And probably if you're distributing by email, this is probably what has been used to guide your efforts. There has been a recent change, and I say that with a caveat. Again, this really has not been printed and published publicly. There's not been a revision to the Drug and Safe Free Schools and Campuses guidebook. But where this change comes from is a final program review determination from Occidental College. Occidental College, in one of their efficiencies, was sending out the notice, and in their program review determination, you will see that they are told an institution may distribute the annual disclosure by electronic mail if it wishes to do so. The method for such a distribution would require the institution to post program materials on its website and then send an email message to each mandatory recipient that includes a direct link to the document. We're sending a general email message to students and employees encouraging them to read all of the college policies does not meet the standard for a direct notice. We have a lot of mandates from the federal government, from state governments, and maybe other entities requiring us to provide information to our students, staff, and faculty. I know on my campus, we have a website where we list all of the different mandates that are required for us to provide information to students. And it would be real easy to sit there and say, you are all, we're required to provide you with information on a wide variety of things. Here's the link, go to it. That would not meet it. When we send a general email message, we have to be very specific and say we're required by the federal government to provide you a drug and alcohol prevention program notice. That notice can be found at this link. Please visit this online policy and read it. So again, we do that separately and distinctly from the other mandates that are out there. One of the other things that we do at Eastern Illinois University that has worked really well for us, we have a student, staff, and faculty portal that is called Pause. And that portal is utilized for a wide variety of things. Students go in and use that to register for classes. They use it to get their grades. We're a textbook rental system. So at the beginning of the semester, they go in to get to find out what textbooks they need. If students are employees, that's where they go to submit their time. Regular employees, staff, and faculty go in to submit their time, look at their benefits, look at their sick leave. It's a pretty comprehensive portal. And we have worked with our IT system to set it up that on September 1st, we have a reset. And after the reset occurs, the first time anyone enters into that pause system, our drug and alcohol prevention program notice pops up. Everyone would read it, scroll down at the bottom, and there's a tab button that they have to hit that indicates that they've received it and they've read it. Once they hit that tab button, it gives them permission to enter into the rest of the portal and go about their business. So it's really nice. Again, it resets annually after September 1st. For our new students who register after that, for new employees who join the institution after that, the first time they enter into pause, it pops up. So again, they must acknowledge, receipt, and read. And for me, who monitors it, if we were to be audited and I was given 50 names, I would go in the system as if I were looking at holds, and it registers it as a fake hold. So I could go in and look at a person's ID, and it would give me a history of every time that they had indicated that they had received and read the notice, and I could give that to an auditor. So it works out really great. For the most part, it is low maintenance. The only thing that I really have to do is once a year look over the policy, make any updates, changes, revisions, and send that to ITS and get that fixed so that way it's up to date. It's probably one of the best things that we have done. I can say that prior to doing it, we would print it out, and it would easily cost us between $10,000 and $15,000 to print out and mail. So it's been a great cost savings for us to do it that way. So when you think about distribution, I would ask you and encourage you to think about your primary methods of distribution, your secondary methods, including passive methods, and again, have multiple methods, but focus on your primary and ensure distribution through those methods. And again, make sure that you are summarizing what you're doing and how you're doing it and how you're getting it out to students, staff, and faculty in your biennial review. Again, whether it's within the body of an email or it's on an online document, I often get asked the question to link or not to link within an electronic document. Past guidance has indicated that the document must be in its entirety and should not have links to other documents or portions of content within the document. I have not seen anything that is different than this guidance, so I would encourage everybody to go ahead and maintain one page, one document, and not link to other pages or other documents. And as we talk about the components of the notification, I'll talk about where I've seen some schools make those links where it may seem to make sense, but where it probably should be avoided. So when we look at content, there are 5 areas that the Department of Ed says should be in this notice. And those 5 areas are broken into standards of conduct, applicable federal, state, local, and institutional sanctions, a description of short and long-term health risks, a list of your alcohol and other drug use prevention and treatment programs which are available to students, staff, and faculty, and then a clear statement that your institution will impose disciplinary sanctions. Again, when we think of the standards of conduct, your standard should cover all students who are registered for one course of any type of unit except for continuing ed. Some things to think about would be your students who work for the institution. Is it possible that they may also be covered by employee policies? So if you have a student employee who comes to work inebriated, ends up under the influence of substances and does something at work, and something happens, will they be covered by the student code of conduct? Will they be covered by employee policies, and how that might be handled? One of the other aspects of standards of conduct is, what does it apply to? It's pretty simple to apply it to all campus activities, as well as all activities that are considered officially sponsored by institutions of higher education. But what about off-campus activities? What's considered an official off-campus activity? My friend and colleague, Peter Lake, will talk extensively about higher ed law, and will often talk about several of the cases in the 80s and 90s where there were off-campus trips where students were drinking, and it was an off-campus trip, but it was an official trip. And as a result of accidents and injuries, that created some problems for institutions as a result of injuries and death. So again, important to think about where your standards of conduct apply. If you have a student organization that has a party off campus, at what point is there enough of a nucleus of that student organization that party could be considered? Well, that's a student organization. It's may not be endorsed by the campus, but it really kind of is an official activity because all the officers of that student group were involved in the planning of that activity. And the advisor was aware of it. Again, it's a gray area, but it is worth consideration and thinking about. It's important to think about that the standards of conduct have been interpreted to apply to student-sponsored social activities, as well as professional meetings that we may attend as employees. So again, this is probably an area where many of us do well at. We probably have standards of conduct, but it's important within our policy and our notice to talk about those standards of conduct, but most importantly, to cover these points as to who those standards of conduct apply to. Second area is legal policies and sanctions. Depending upon what kind of school you are, whether you are a four-year residential institution, commuter institution, an online institution, maybe a community college, maybe a trade school. You will want to think about what fits best for you in terms of local laws and policies, state law, federal law, regarding unlawful possession or distribution of illicit drugs and alcohol. For example, Eastern is a residential institution. We reside in Charleston, Illinois. So for us to include local ordinances and laws, that's pretty simple for us to call the city and say what's going on, what are the alcohol and other drug laws and ordinances that students typically violate, and are able, then to put that into our policy. We know we're in the state of Illinois, so we're able to get that information as well as the federal information. If you are a community college and your community college covers 8 or 9 counties, it may not make much sense for you to try to cover all the local ordinances of all the communities in that 8 or 9 county service catchment area. So you may have to figure out what is going to be best for your institution. What is important to remember is that, your policy should stipulate that anyone who violates the policy is subject to both your institution sanctions as well as criminal sanctions. It may be that your institution only applies institutional sanctions for some things, refers out to local municipalities or state municipalities for criminal sanctions, maybe both, but to have your bases covered, it's probably wise to stipulate that anyone who violates policy is subject to both. Here is an example of legal policies and sanctions for a campus. This is how we approach it at EIU. We typically look at our most common policy violations. So this is not an exhaustive list. It doesn't include everything. And what you will find is that we have put our typical offenses. It's not to sit there and say that these are the only sanctions that may come up, but these are the things that we typically will adjudicate and prescribe to students that have been found in violation. My recommendation is to do what is typical. I've seen some schools who typically will go up to and put a worst case scenario. And when I've been on those campuses and talking with students, what I often will say is, okay, this is the worst case scenario. And they'll say, we don't know anybody who's ever had that worst case scenario. What we hear is, they get a $50 fine. I would suggest be realistic, be real with what you typically do, and not try to scare or frighten students away from use by giving a worst case scenario. Do what you typically do on your college campus. Depending upon if you decide to put local ordinances, underage drinking ordinances, fines and sanctions, marijuana ordinances, fines and sanctions, fake IDs, party ordinances, those types of things. Every community is different, and one of the things that I've found is in developing this section and revising this section, this is a great way to develop relationships with local partners in the community. It helps to figure out what's going on, what are the problems, and it allows you to bring some information back in addition to the content for these areas to help develop a strategic plan, as well as build partnerships for the biennial review, which again is a session later on down the road. When you look at the state, every state is different, but typically there will be unlawful use of fake IDs, driving under the influence, whether it's over 21 or under 21. And most states have some statutory provisions for illegal drug use and manufacture. With the current trends in marijuana use, things are constantly changing. So every state has different marijuana use laws. If you have not updated your drug and alcohol prevention notice to reflect those changes, that is something that I would strongly encourage everybody to do. But that would be the type of content that you would include in a document for the state. This information may be a little bit more readily available. Here you'll see basically a table that we created from the Illinois compiled statutes. It was pretty easy to get. We were able to get this information online and then convert it to a table that we insert within our document. For us, it's just a matter of, once a year going to those compiled statutes, making sure that there haven't been any changes and revising and updating as needed. When we look at the federal, some things that you might consider are those things that would affect financial aid and such, denial of federal aid. I believe that may have been revoked since this presentation was created, forfeiture of personal property, and then the federal drug trafficking and possession penalties. And as you will see, you can typically find some tables that would have similar information to the state tables. And again, these are pretty easy to find, particularly from the DEA websites. Another area that needs to be included is health risk. And typically when we think of this section, you want to talk about different illicit drugs and alcohol that occurs on your campus. And again, I want to stress that this section is really to be focused on those drugs that are used on your campus. And the Department of Ed really considers this part of the policy notice to represent the minimal level of information that a school must distribute to students. So this section is really important as well. Typically, what most schools will include in this portion of the document would be the different substance, the risk of dependence, possible short-term effects of that substance, possible long-term effect of that substance, and then if there is a potential of overdose, the effects of overdose of that substance. The format that is used varies from campus to campus. You'll see some that use tables, some that use paragraphs and have text. It really greatly varies. For this presentation and for the biennial, for the policy notice that we have at campus and that IHEC uses, we actually use a table, and you'll see that we include a section with nicknames and slang terms. We'll use the short-term effects and the long-term effects, as well as whether or not it's physically dependent or psychologically dependent in the long-term effects. Again, I want to stress this section and some considerations. What I see a lot of times is that people will use a shotgun approach. And once they have created this list, they never alter it. And they just typically list common categories. While many people may not think about this, what you put in this section really implies that these are the drugs that are used by your students currently on your campus. So one of the best examples that I can give is that I will review drug and alcohol prevention program notices, and I will see schools that wrote this originally in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they will have GHB, Rohypnol, and what were considered popular date rape drugs at that point in time. And I'll be talking to whoever I'm working with, and I'll say, are you having problems with these drugs? No. Anybody been arrested for these drugs? No, no. When was the last time that anyone got arrested for these drugs? I not since I've been here. Um, I would encourage you to look over that list and really look at the drugs which are the ones that are being used and abused by your students. This may be a way of you having some power to shorten the size of the document, especially if you have evidence and data that certain drugs are not being widely used by students at your campus. Because if you put it in there, again, it kind of implies that, yeah, these drugs are being used at our school. The next section is for drug and alcohol programs. And this is where you provide a description of any substance programs that are available to students, as well as your employees and staff. And this is where, within the mandate, within the regulations, that you really get to look at the spectrum or continuum of care. The Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act is really a primary prevention program. So we're really looking at prevention programming. We're not typically looking at assessment, intervention, treatment, rehab, reentry, or recovery. The Drug-Free Schools Act is a prevention program. But in this section, we get to cover the whole gamut. So you want to highlight your prevention programs. If you have assessment and intervention, you want to talk about that aspect of your campus. If you have treatment and counseling, you'll want to talk about that. If you have a rehab program, or if you have a reentry or recovery program, you can add those elements to this policy, provide those programs and those services some promotion and some opportunity to have some exposure to everybody who's getting this particular notice. Now, some campuses are far better resourced and staffed and funded than others. Your campus may be one that doesn't have the staffing and resources. If you don't have a continuum of care on campus, but you have partnerships with community partners. I know several community colleges don't have substance abuse treatment, but they have memorandums of understanding and contracts to provide services to local substance use providers in the community. That's great. If you have those relationships, this is an area where you can highlight those relationships and how you provide substance use treatment to your students, staff, and faculty. Most campuses have an employee assistance program for staff and faculty. You would want to include that, a description of that service and how to access that service in this drug and alcohol program section. One of the things that I would encourage you to think about, if you are including off-campus entities, you will probably want to consider creating some guidelines as to who to place on your notice. In our community, we had a long-standing substance use agency, treatment center, residential, outpatient, had been here quite a long time, and we had them on our notice. And over time, we started having other agencies focusing on substance use. And it wasn't intentional, but we accidentally omitted other agencies. And then we started having more individual counselors who had their own individual practices focusing on substance use. And it became a kerfuffle because everybody wanted to be on our notice. And it was adding significantly to the length of our notice. So we sat down and we had to start thinking about who we would add to our notice as off-campus treatment providers. And we started looking at location and service area. Were they being contracted by the state? Were they certified through the state Department of Alcohol and Substance Abuse? Were they just independent practitioners? Were they certified? Were they licensed? Did we have memorandums of understanding with them? So we started looking at those things. And that's how we've started deciding who gets put on our notice and who doesn't get put on our notice. You may need to think about similar things, especially if you have a large catchment area, say you're a community college where you cover 8 or 9 counties. You may have to do those things. The last section is disciplinary sanctions, that you will clearly state that you will impose the sanctions consistent with local, state, and federal law. I think this is an important place to talk about, will you focus on off-campus events and situations and behaviors, or will you only focus on those things that occur on campus property or during on-campus events, regardless of whether they occur on or off campus, and a description of those sanctions, including and up to expulsion or termination. And again, being very clear about what can happen. One of the things about disciplinary sanction enforcement is that who that is up to is not stated within the regulations. It's kind of considered an institutional process, and I think many of our institutions have adopted that over 32 years. So whether it's one office or another, there are typically many parties involved, whether it's campus security, residence hall staff, if you're a residential system, dean of students, student conduct, health providers, faculty, students. It's probably a comprehensive approach on your campus involving many hands. And that seems to be a standard of care that many campuses embrace. When you look at your drug and alcohol prevention program notice, it should be reviewed at least as part of your biennial review process. And as I've said earlier, your biennial review really should have a section detailing how it's distributed, who gets it, how it's reviewed, who's involved in the review process. If you make any changes to your program notice, those should be included in that section. And if there are any recommendations to the document or the process in getting the document, that needs to be made within the biennial review suggestions for the next biennium as well. In conclusion, what I would say is that this area of the mandate of the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act is probably the one that is the most specific. It is the one that is the most concrete. Therefore, it is the one that is most easily checked and reviewed by auditors. For those of you that were not with us last time, remember, most of the auditors that are coming are lawyers and attorneys. They're not higher education folks. They're not substance abuse providers. They're not health educators. Many might have conducted previous reviews. They may know a lot about the drug-free schools. They may know very little about the drug-free schools, but this is one of the areas that is probably best easily reviewed by a checklist or a rubric. So it's probably going to be most scrutinized. This policy does require upkeep and maintenance. I always encourage a team effort. It just can't be the work of one office. And usually if you can get other partners involved in this process, it will lead to greater success. So with that, I am willing to take any questions that you have. And I'm going to open up the question box. Questions? Michael has asked, are there any good resources for templates? We actually have templates. So I have a template for a drug and alcohol prevention program notice that is a Microsoft Word doc. We also have a template for an outline for a biennial review document. And we also have a Microsoft Word doc for a certification document. So we will go ahead and send those out to everybody so that way you all can have them. For those of you that are in Illinois, the drug and alcohol prevention program notice probably may be more relevant since it'll have Illinois laws and things like that. I would have to check with Madison to see if she and her staff have been able to update that document lately. So if we gave that to you, I would go ahead and make sure that the content in there is correct. Andrea has asked, how do we delineate the state laws regarding cannabis and federal law? Oh, that's my favorite topic. Oh, that's just a hot potato. The simplest statement is there is a discrepancy between the two. They are not in alignment. And this act, as well as the Drug-Free Workplace, the Americans with Disability Act, are all federal laws. They all consider cannabis and marijuana use illegal. And to promote or allow any use would be against the federal law. It could also be considered a violation of the Title IV financial aid contract. So if you were to sit there and say, yes, allow marijuana use on your campus, the feds could come in and say, well, we're going to take away your financial aid. We're going to fine you. We're going to sanction you. Not that that's happened. I think it's important to put both information in your day app. So I think it's important to put the federal information, put a statement that says, this is federal law, is an institution receiving federal funds while you're on campus, while you're at an official campus activity. These are our rules, these are our expectations. If you are off campus, not engaged in an official campus activity, these are our state laws, these are our community laws. If you are off campus, these are the expectations. If you end up getting caught, this is what will happen. And again, that's going to be very individualized by state and by community. Who would be a good contact to work with locally? Hannah, not necessarily certain if you are meaning to work with local ordinances. Usually the state's attorney is a good contact. Working with your local municipal police is a good contact to begin with. If you are looking at geography restricted to a municipality, looking at an alcohol control commissioner or someone within your municipality who may be overseeing marijuana or cannabis licensing, that may be help as well. So, you know, those would be people that I would typically look at. Another person to maybe look at, I know on our campus, we have a student fee that provides a student legal counsel. So there's actually a student attorney that students can go to for legal advice. So I've actually used that person on our campus to look over things as well, particularly the local ordinances. I've got a great relationship with that individual, and usually she's been pretty willing to work with me and look over things and catch things that we have missed. Paula has asked where the recordings are. Paula, they are probably likely on our website, which is www.eiu.edu/IHEC. And on there ought to be a tab for professional development webinars. And under that, there should be a tab for past webinars. And I believe Madison has the recordings there. Is there any movement to update? I wish I had a crystal ball. I keep thinking I'm going to write a book on this subject. And what keeps holding me off is the fear that the book hasn't been revised, and my fear is I'll go through writing a book, and as soon as I get ready to publish it, they'll revise it and it'll change everything. We really thought that with the Clary Compliance Division taking over when they were going to revise Clary in 2016, we would have, in addition to the Clary book, covering drug-free schools. That didn't happen. I just can't answer this. I don't think so. I keep thinking that there will be, and I'm not hearing anything. I know for a while there was some movement legislatively to try to change the law and the regulations, but I don't believe that got very far either. So I keep hoping, and I keep knocking on wood that we'll see some updates, but I'm just not optimistic at this time. I'll have to admit, I saw a draft of the updated legislation that was being advocated for, and it kind of scared me. One of the things that was in the piece of legislation was a requirement that every institution adopt an evidence-based program. And they had a list of evidence-based programs. And as I sat there and I thought about the spectrum of institutions that receive federal funding, I was like, wow, that's going to be really hard for like community colleges or barber schools or nursing schools to put into place something like basics or anything else that would be a higher tier level of evidence-based programs. I don't see that happening as an unfunded mandate for a lot of institutions. I think it would cause a lot of duress. So we'll have to see what happens, but I've not heard anything regarding updates. I could be surprised. It could happen tomorrow, but at this point in time, my sources haven't given me any indication that anything new is coming down the pike. Oh, type the website. Let me do that. Yeah, one sec. Gone ahead and type that address in the chat box, everyone. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm going to address Paula's question about the session 1 recording. We do have all of them up on our YouTube channel. We haven't got to updating the website yet, but we should be updating the website in particular later this week. But they are on our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and then search for the Illinois Higher Education Center, we should have all of the past recordings up there.
Again, today was session 2 of a 4-part series. Our next session is next week. Then the following session is on June 8th. So just to put that out there, we do have one last question that popped in. The individual works at a university that all students are over 23 and they live on campus. Will we be required to limit the use of alcohol consumption on campus? Essentially, you will not be barred from limiting or, basically having prohibition on campus. So, you can have the use of alcohol on campus. Your campus is a special population, so I would say probably the policies that you would end up having would be, how do you address abuse? How do you address misuse? And then, how do you address any behavioral issues that would relate to the overconsumption of alcohol? Probably what you might be more worried about it is not necessarily alcohol, but possibly marijuana use as well as other illicit drugs. Um, as I'm sitting here pondering this, the one thing I would say is um, I would go ahead and make sure that you have some policy. It would be real easy to sit there and say all of our students are of our age. There's no need for us to have policy, and that could get you in trouble. I've talked with religious institutions who have sat down and said, well, we require our students not to drink and to sign um, uh, agreements that they don't drink. So why do we even have to worry about this? Why do we have to have prevention programming? And the reality of it is yes, you still have to do these things. It's federal law, and chances are your students aren't as wholesome as you think. So yes, the question is, we're in Illinois and marijuana is legal. Will we have to prohibit use on campus? And the answer is yes, you do. In this case, the federal law supersedes the state law, especially if you are receiving Title IV money, if you are distributing financial aid to your students, or if you are receiving any form of federal grants, if your faculty are writing federal grants, that's part of the conditions. So yes, you're not allowed to have any marijuana, cannabis, CBD use, anything like that on your campus. It's one of the misalignments between state law and federal law, but currently right now we are unable to allow marijuana or cannabis use as a result of federal law and the financial Title IV contracts. With that, here is my contact information. If anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me, as well as Madison and her staff, Jennifer, and others within the IHEC organization. We will do our best to attend to your needs. And we look forward to seeing you all again next week. Next week's presentation will focus more on what is intended by the Department of Ed as a program to address substance use, and some of the models that we have out there to lead and guide us in the development and implementation of a comprehensive substance use program. And then the last session, session 4, will focus on the biennial review and how to engage in that process and what it should look like and what the review should include, and how to go about doing that process. So we've enjoyed having you all today. You've been a great audience, great questions, great participation. Thank you for the positive feedback, and have a great week. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Davidson, for the presentation and everyone for attending. The certificates will be emailed out within 10 to 15 business days. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.